Okay, and we will send links afterward to the recording as well as other links that are relevant to what we talk about today. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here and attending. We had 43 states register for this session, which is absolutely incredible, plus Puerto Rico and Saskatchewan. So welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I think this is so cool because what opportunity do we have often to get lots of states on one call? So my name is Sarah Kendrick. I'm a migratory bird biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but for the last 9 years, I worked with the Missouri Department of Conservation. And for the last 5 of those, I was the ornithologist for the state. So I've been with the Road to Recovery group with the steering committee since 2020. So I wanted to just welcome everybody again and say that today, what are we all doing here today? We're here to introduce states to the Road to Recovery, what it is, what we're doing, and what we're working toward, and how states in particular can plug in, especially with Rawa coming down the pike. This meeting is very laid back and informal. We want your engagement. We're going to have at least 30 minutes at the end for good discussion and questions. So please take notes of those throughout so that we have a good, rich discussion at the end. So as we all know, you all are the ones on the ground. States are the ones who make it happen on the ground. We run habitat management with other NGOs and groups that do habitat management. And implementation, we are writing the swaps. You all are essential. I clearly have a fondness for states. In fact, I'm not sure when exactly I'll stop thinking of myself as a state agency person, so forgive me. But Rawa is hopefully coming down the pike, and that changes things for a lot of us, especially with wildlife diversity programs and non-game species research and conservation efforts. So a few comments I must put out there and make up front about Road to Recovery, regardless of what you've heard or not heard about the Road to Recovery. We're here to tell you, we're not here to tell you a brand new approach. Many of you are already doing what we present in terms of co-production and broad partnerships. We know you guys are all out there working very hard and working with lots of partners. What we are here to tell you is what Road to Recovery is and present some actions and ideas that we feel are essential in the face of the 3 billion bird declines. And with Rawa, again, coming on the pike, where we feel states can be effective in plugging in. I will say it probably multiple times today, but there's a way for every state to plug in, I think, to one of these efforts we present today in some shape or form. Again, we're not saying these are the only ways to plug in, but they are targeted ideas and gaps that have risen to the surface in our 2 years of discussions with R2R, and we've identified it through our collective experiences. But we also want to hear your thoughts. We know we don't have all the answers, and we want your thoughts, ideas, and to get feedback and engagement at the end. So we'll have at least 30 minutes for that at the end. I recognize that this is a very diverse group. I mean, having even 20 or 30, much less 40 plus states, we're going to be all over the map on every single topic we bring up today. So maybe your state is already involved in southern wings, or you could give more, or maybe you're not involved in southern wings yet. Maybe you don't know what southern wings is. Maybe your state already has bird declines and full life cycle bird conservation verbiage already integrated into your swap. Maybe you don't. Maybe your state has planned how it will spend every penny of Rawa funds if that happens. Maybe your state hasn't done that planning yet. Please just know that we don't mean to condescend by sharing these ideas and that we're working to make many points to a very broad audience. So thank you for hanging in there with us. It is a very diverse group. So I was invited to participate in the Road to Recovery, I think, because of my state agency perspective, in addition to my charming personality. And I must say that it has been a road. So we met over a year and a half, every 2 weeks, to have open discussions, plan 3 webinars for different audiences. And here I was, a state person invited to this group with big names like Ken Rosenberg and Pete Mara and Tom Will. And I felt really special to be part of that group and invited. But then I got over that feeling special, and I was honestly pleasantly shocked to realize that my perspective was valued in this group as a state agency, and that these guys have been around and they want to empower the next group of conservation leaders. They want to embrace all members of this conservation society to make a difference for birds. And they verbalize that, which I think is very powerful. And so as an R2R team, I think the great strengths of our group are open dialogue, inspiration, and calls to action. I'm inspired by our group's ability to ask for us to plug in now to get to work. I know many of you are already at work, and I know that. And I hope we can all find additional ways to plug in now and to do that today. So because as many of us know, we just don't have the time to waste with a lot of these populations rapidly declining. So I am optimistic. I know that we can pull together to help slow bird declines and fill knowledge gaps, get more habitat on the ground, and Rawa may empower some of us to do more of that in this arena. But we need states, we need you all, and we honestly cannot make this dent without you all on board, both mentally and physically. So that might sound dumb, but to curb these declines, we really need everyone. We need all hands on deck because we really, again, we don't have the time to waste, and we can do this. So to grossly oversimplify the situation, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? So today, first we'll hear from Paul Schmidt, who's the Road to Recovery Director and retired Fish and Wildlife Service in Ducks Unlimited. Then we'll hear from Ken Rosenberg, who is, of course, the lead author on the 3 Billion Birds Science publication and retired Cornell Lab of Ornithology and many other things. He'll talk about the bird declines, the road to recovery approach and progress. And then Edwin Juarez with Arizona Game and Fish Department and I will chat through ways that states can plug into these opportunities, followed by at least 30 minutes of discussion. So as you know, we can't do that discussion and engagement piece without you. So I'm begging you now to write down your questions, unmute yourselves and ask your questions at the end. We will also have the chat open for questions, but we would really like your engagement and ideas. So note those along the way. So I would like to introduce Paul Schmidt. Paul had a 33-year career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, focusing his work on national wildlife refuges and migratory birds, and serving the last 8 years as the Assistant Director for the Migratory Bird Program. From 2011 to 17, he served as Ducks Unlimited's Chief Conservation Officer. And during his tenure with Fish and Wildlife Service, Paul was a champion for non-game birds, helped create the permanent PIF coordinator position, and chaired the PIF Council. So with his insider knowledge of how agencies worked, Paul was a natural choice to direct R2R's efforts for a coordinated response to 3 billion birds. So I welcome you, Paul, and take it away.
Well, thanks very much. Let's see. Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you and Edwin in particular for organizing this session. As Sarah indicated, I was enjoying retirement when the likes of Pete Mara, Ken Rosenberg, and Bob Ford called to talk to me about the road to recovery. They hooked me at hello, and I'm excited to be involved and get one more final chance to contribute to conservation of our shared birds. I think we have a real opportunity this time to be successful, being at the important crossroads in our bird conservation journey. I want to also say a special thanks to the Knobloch Family Foundation and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for believing in us enough to financially support this effort and to get it started. The 3 billion bird loss paper was an eye-opener for all of us who have worked in bird conservation over the past few decades. That report should humble us all. It certainly humbled me. In summary, it said to me, we can't continue to do the same things that we've done at the same speed. Or as Pete and Ken like to say, we must reimagine bird conservation. Hearing about the need to focus on recovering birds was my aha moment. The key word is recovering. While we've done a lot of great work over this time through important institutions such as Flyways, Partners in Flight, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, and many more, the road to recovery is filling a critical niche in the fabric of conservation. It is advocating for recovering species before listing them as endangered or threatened. It's about being strategic and efficient with the limited resources we have. Technology and bird science have come a long way, and we have the tools available to understand the full life cycle of birds, and we have the institutions in place to deliver the science needed to develop and implement conservation treatments. Science is key to our success. While very important to our work, broad landscape conservation alone won't address the growing list of species that we see in steep decline. R2R has held several workshops at this stage. I hope you've participated in one or more of them. In those workshops, we covered the science, the advancement in technology, and important new elements in our process, including social science, co-production, and communications. If you were not able to join for those workshops, go to the website at Amara Lab at Georgetown University and check them out. I like to think we're doing science through including co-production on a single species to understand the limiting factors, and then with the help of social science and human dimensions, driving multi-species conservation treatments. Looking at some of the successful recovery efforts of the past, we can learn how this might work, but now doing this before a species is listed. We've turned many species around that were on the brink, like bald eagle, Kirtland's warbler, brown pelican, and many more. Now, none of those turnarounds would have occurred with landscape conservation alone. We needed science to inform us what was causing the decline and limiting its recovery to design specific actions or conservation treatments. This science work on species can serve to complement the broad landscape level conservation that is ongoing and continues to work on important habitat. It isn't a case of one or the other. We need both. I'd like to see the connectivity between these two elements be strengthened. Species work complements landscape work. Species working groups have developed organically over time to focus on bird species that need recovery. We hope to help these passionate groups who are operating without any funding to get the capacity and resources needed to become recovery teams that use tools and techniques that we think can help. We need more species groups, we need more species teams, and we need each of them to have full-time positions as recovery leaders to make this work. Having worked in this field for decades, there are lots of important threads in the fabric of conservation. There are structures, collaborations, partnerships that are a place to build upon. They're the flyways, the joint ventures, things like the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, Partners in Flight, recently the Grassland Summit, Shorebird Plan, Waterbirds for the Americas, North American Wetlands Conservation Act, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, Southern Wings, the list goes on, and importantly, the state wildlife action plans. And now with the road to recovery filling a critical niche, I think we really do have a chance to be successful. If I didn't think we'd be successful, I wouldn't be on the screen. I'd probably be on a golf course somewhere. And now with the potential for recovering America's Wildlife Act, or Rawa, we're going to truly have something to make a difference. States are incredibly important if the R2R approach is going to work. States have a long record of leading in wildlife conservation. Examples in bird conservation include the flyways, both the waterfowl side and now the non-game side, North American Waterfowl Management Plan, Partners in Flight, and many more. We know that Rawa can be a game changer. And there are other sources out there to gather the match that we know you need. We're working to help get that match for this work so that Rawa can be the big driver in the road forward. Birds bring ready-made partners and ready-made partnerships. We need you. And I again want to thank you for attending. And now let me introduce the main speaker for today's session. Ken Rosenberg recently retired from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where he worked for 28 years as a conservation scientist. Ken was active in Partners in Flight since its beginning, was the chair of the Partners in Flight Science Committee for 10 years, and led the publication of the Partners in Flight 2016 Land Bird Conservation Plan. Was my partner in developing the State of the Birds report under NABC since 2008 by being the science lead, and most recently was a lead author in the landmark publication in 2019 in Science that documented the loss of 3 billion birds from North America avifauna. Ken, along with Pete Mara and others, helped to launch the Road to Recovery initiative as part of a coordinated response to the 3 billion bird publication, and since retirement has remained active on our R2R core team. And as everybody knows, he's an all-around great guy who's committed to making a difference in bird conservation. Ken, take it away.
Let's see, I have the high-tech portion of the program. Okay, where are we?
Swap.
Swap.
Great.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thanks to Sarah and Edwin and others for organizing this. And thanks to this fantastic group that's assembled. It's so great to see all the state people. Paul had asked me for a bio and I just said all around great guys. So he just kind of elaborated on the rest of it, I think. So as Paul said, the unprecedented response that and recent efforts that we've seen to address this loss of 3 billion birds comes at a time when we might also be seeing unprecedented investment in resources to address non-game wildlife, and especially within the states with Rawa hopefully coming down the pike. So I'm going to describe an approach we're calling the Road to Recovery, touch on a lot of the themes that Paul just really talked about, and show how it could benefit and provide guidance to the states for using these new resources, hopefully, to restore populations of priority bird species. And we hope that this presentation is going to stimulate your input, questions, and discussion after the talk. So it's been more than 2 years since this paper came out. That's pretty hard to believe. And this big news that we've lost 2.9 billion birds from the avifauna. More than 300 species have declined. So this publication succeeded in getting everyone's attention. Bring back 3 billion birds has become this clarion cry that helped to galvanize really a new level of concern and support for bird conservation across agencies, organizations, and the public. And I think we're still in this moment of time for conservation. On the one hand, it's a rekindling of a lot of the energy that we saw and was present in Partners in Flight and elsewhere in the early 90s. And in some ways, our messages are not really that new. But on the other hand, it's time to rethink some of our paradigms and change business as usual. So for the 3 billion birds paper, we broke the loss down for groups of species in several ways, such as across major breeding habitats or biomes shown in the inset map here on the right. So on this slide, the absolute change in abundance for each biome is graphed in the left panel, and the relative change in abundance is shown in the bars in the middle. So when we look across all the biomes, we see a net loss in nearly every habitat, including generalists. And the largest loss, both absolute and relative, was in grassland birds, which are the gold-colored lines here, a loss of 700 million individual birds, more than half of all grassland birds since 1970. And we estimate that another 500 million birds have been lost from the boreal forests, that's in the dark green line. During this time, the only biome to show a moderate increase was wetland birds. And as you can see, these don't even come close to compensating for the losses. And this is because the wetland bird populations are so small, they're much smaller than terrestrial bird populations. All wetland birds combined don't even make up a single population or add up to a single population of a sparrow or a warbler or, say, the American robin. So what are the primary causes of these declines? Our study did not specifically address the causes, and these are not easy to pin down, as we'll say again and again, for individual species. But we know from lots of other evidence that habitat loss and degradation are the primary drivers of declines. And a common theme in the largest declines that we saw, grassland birds, but plus other common species of open fields and open habitats such as red-winged blackbirds and grackles even, is that these are birds associated with agricultural landscapes. So what we're seeing with the intensification of agriculture is where not long ago there were fallow fields, grassy margins, hedgerows. Now it's often horizon to horizon cornfields and other crops, with also more intensive use of more toxic pesticides. So this, combined with urban sprawl, the loss of tropical forests where many of our birds migrate, we're seeing nature squeezed out of the landscape to the point where these landscapes cannot really support basic bird populations. And on top of this, there are the many human-caused factors that we all know kill huge numbers of birds. These might not be the primary drivers of the declines, but they make it more difficult for birds to survive in the remaining habitats. And these are all things we can do something about. We have proven solutions for minimizing this human-caused mortality. But because we're seeing declines that are so pervasive across many habitats, groups of species, we know these birds are facing multiple interacting threats, and many of these are difficult for us to measure, such as pesticides, energy development, light pollution from cities, increasing frequency of extreme weather, all exacerbated by climate change. So conservation has just not been happening at a large enough scale to counter these negative forces, and we're sort of losing the battle, unfortunately. But still, we have lots of reasons for hope. We know that bird populations can be resilient and that not every bird species is declining. We have examples, the remarkable recovery of the bald eagle and other birds of prey once we removed DDT, reduced persecution, those direct factors that were affecting their populations. We know that the Endangered Species Act is our last line of defense against extinction, and it's brought species back, like the bald eagle and peregrine falcon, from the brink. More recently, we've seen Kirtland's warblers populations continue to increase, and just in 2019, they were taken off the endangered species. So we know that recovery can work. Perhaps the most hopeful example is the increase in waterfowl populations, more than a 50% increase since 1970. And this is not an accident, as we know. It was waterfowl hunters who noticed the population declines, and they did something about it, raised their voices, put money where their mouths are. The result were policies, the NAWCA, and dedicated funding streams that has protected and restored millions of acres of wetlands, and duck populations rebounded, providing sustainable recreational hunting. And state agencies, of course, have been at the forefront of waterfowl conservation. So the big question moving forward now, how do we replicate these successes for other birds? Another reason for hope is the phenomenal response that we've had to the publication of our paper. Hundreds of articles from press in the US and beyond. We had front page headlines, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. More than 1,700 media outlets covered this story, reaching 3.8 billion people worldwide. And so we know that people really do care about birds. So we're hoping that the 3 Billion Birds paper and the response that it's gotten is going to will continue to serve as a catalyst for change. What we've been doing in conservation over the past 30 years has not been enough to stem the loss of bird populations. It's really time to reimagine some of the basic paradigms of bird conservation. The most important thing is we now need to be much more strategic and focused on where we implement conservation actions. We've been addressing broad-scale threats and habitat needs, but in most cases, we don't really know the specific causes of species declines. So to be more strategic, we need a better idea of what the limiting factors are, where and when in the annual cycle these factors are acting. So the response to the 3 billion birds loss paper has been mostly focused on a set of big new opportunities that are in front of us today that were not really present 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And these have been come to be called the 5 game changers that can help us change business as usual and to frame our response to 3 billion birds lost. And this framework has been adopted by the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, NABC, as the strategic goals for the bird conservation community over the next few years. And so there's a lot going on now in bird conservation, and the new science that we're promoting in Road to Recovery is one of these game changers. And another is the bold new legislative agenda that's happening, including Rawa. And this intersection of new science and new funding streams is what really can make this time different. So as I said, one of the game changers is the advances in the science itself, especially technological, methodological advances that enable us to determine the specific causes of bird declines. And we argue that this needs to happen on a species by species basis, because even species in the same habitat have different biology and under different threats throughout their annual cycle. And this realization led us to develop Road to Recovery as part of the coordinated response to 3 billion birds, a reimagining of this conservation process. So our approach involves, pretty simply, deciding which species to focus on first, because we know we can't do everything, targeting research to fill critical knowledge gaps to determine these limiting factors, and then make sure that the new information makes it into conservation plans and to managers who can implement these actions on the ground. And using advances in social science and co-production to make sure that the recovery is sustainable. And this is the process, the approach that we're referring to as the Road to Recovery. So that first step of identifying the highest priority species to apply the Road to Recovery approach, we looked for species that met 3 criteria. They needed to already be species of high concern. So they're on the watch list, for example, using Partners in Flight's species assessment process, and species that showed steep declines, of more than a 50% loss since 1970. And this was based on the analysis we did for the science paper. And that graph in the middle, chestnut color longspur declines is one example. And we used new metrics of urgency, focusing on the most recent trends and then projecting them forward to see which species are expected to lose another 50% of their population in the near future, for example. So that right-hand graph, which is yellow-billed magpie, shows that accelerating recent decline, increasing the urgency for that species. So this process resulted in about 62 species, actually, that meet all 3 of those criteria based on the data that we have, the long-term monitoring data. And then another 29 species that probably meet the criteria, but are data deficient. We don't have long-term monitoring data, but we know that they're in urgent trouble. So these are the species most likely to slip into threatened and endangered status in the near future, and for which it is imperative that we identify and address the specific causes of decline. And we're calling this list the species on the brink. So the species on this list are not a surprise. Some of the groups of birds that Partners in Flight and other initiatives have focused on since the beginning. Grassland birds, shorebirds, specialized forest birds, aerial insectivores, seabirds, which don't get a lot of attention, but which are nearly all threatened at this point. But so within each of these groups, we've now identified a set of species with the highest urgency for addressing their declines. Now, I want to emphasize that all of these species are already on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Birds of Conservation Concern list, and a vast majority of them are species of greatest conservation need in multiple states. And that's because all of these lists are now based on the same assessment database, the Avian Conservation Assessment Database. So we know, we're very aware that there's list fatigue out there, and it's like, oh my God, another list. But we really want you to think of this list as just a subset of lists that we already have. And it's a way to target actions to the most urgent needs of these species. So a next step is to assess each species in terms of where they are along this road to recovery. So even though we have so much better data on birds than most other taxa, for a majority of species, we have little to no information in terms of why they're declining. So one example over on the left, evening grosbeak, this is a species that the data says has lost 90% of its population since 1970. And we have almost no idea why those declines are occurring, even though groups are starting to work on that now. We have species like the pinyon jay, where a working group has formed. There's some research going on, but we still have very little knowledge in terms of their declines. Then golden wing warbler is an example of a bird where there's a whole initiative in terms of research and planning on both breeding and wintering grounds, but we still don't really know exactly where the species is limited. And then we move up to a bird like salt marsh sparrow, and there's a recent implementation strategy released by the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture that has specific management actions, costs to address a key limiting factor, in this case, sea level rise. And that's probably the best example I've seen of a recovery plan for a non-listed species. And we're trying to get to that point that the Kirtland warbler is, where limiting factors have been identified, being addressed, the species is recovering and can be taken off of the list. And in our case, never going on to the endangered species list. So as Paul said, to advance this necessary science, we've hosted a series of workshops. The first workshop focused on concepts and approaches for understanding population limitation, causes of declines. The second workshop focused on new technologies and methods for identifying linked populations, which are really important in studying migratory connectivity and collecting the demographic data we need to advance species along the road to recovery. More than 300 participants took part in these workshops, and I know that a lot of you were there. The workshops were all recorded, and anyone can access these materials at that Marolab Road to Recovery website. The third workshop, which we held last July, was really about developing a process for sustained bird population recovery. And it's centered on the notion that bird conservation and species recovery will not be successful without considering the needs and values of people, from policymakers and land managers to food producers and consumers. The challenge then is, how do we incorporate these human dimensions into the species recovery process? So this workshop focused on applying the broad concepts of social science, co-production, and strategic communications. We concluded that recovery has two components, which is an intersection between the biological and social science that's necessary not only to eliminate the implementation gap, but to make recovery sustainable. So as this Road to Recovery initiative grew, we narrowed our scope to 3 goals. Develop this process and garner the resources necessary to support that process for sustainable species recovery, starting with species on the brink of becoming endangered. And promote the targeted and actionable science, including both biological and social science, necessary to recover bird populations. And then increase the efficiency and effectiveness of implementation using social science, co-production, and strategic communications to eliminate the gap between science and implementation. So those are our primary goals. We've put together and what we're calling an organizing committee of very diverse groups, a lot of familiar names on this list representing different agencies, different countries. And now that Sarah has jumped ship and become a Fed, she's still on there as her Missouri affiliation. We need more input from a state agency perspective on Road to Recovery. So to test this approach that's being developed, we've received generous support from the Knobloch Family Foundation to fund 3 pilot species projects. And this funding is being used to support 3 species working groups that are at different stages in the recovery process. Lesser yellowlegs, golden wing warbler, and evening grosbeak. And I know that a lot of folks involved, some of the folks involved in these projects are participating today. Our goal with these pilot projects is to show a proof of concept that an infusion of funding and support can be used by these groups to do the necessary research and advance species along the road to recovery. And our hope is to secure additional funding for additional species in the future. So now we want to think about applying this road to recovery approach to the species of greatest conservation need that are in the state wildlife action plans that you all have developed. And many of these species have been recognized as priorities by Partners in Flight and other initiatives for a long time. And many already have working groups that have formed and conservation plans in various stages of development. So one of the main goals of Road to Recovery right now is to supercharge these species working groups, to develop a more formal framework for recovering populations that's efficient and effective with goals and accountability. And we've begun to outline this framework coming out of that, our 3rd workshop, with this guidance document that was produced by the species working group folks who participated, and that is also available. I think you've got it as part of your materials. So engaging and supporting these species working groups is one of the immediate ways that state agencies can join in Road to Recovery. We're focusing on recovery here, which is not the same as management or conservation to address broad threats, although both are certainly important. And it might require management for specific demographic parameters, for example, increasing productivity or survival, not just bird numbers. But again, we need to know exactly what's limiting the population, where and when that limitation is occurring, in order to be more targeted in our management. Now, recovery, at least in the US, has been reserved for federally listed species with legal mandates. But what we're saying now is we need proactive recovery of species before they become endangered or listed. And we know we're hearing pushback on this perception that we're taking an individual species approach to high concern species. And although we argue that recovery strategies and goals need to be developed on a species by species basis, we're not saying that implementation of these strategies should happen for each species separately. In fact, for conservation to be effective and efficient, it must address the common needs and threats across suites of species. And it must certainly be tied to other landscape or ecosystem scale actions that go beyond birds. And the scaling up from species to landscapes is still one of the major challenges we face. So what we're saying is that single versus multi-species approaches is really a false dichotomy. And like a lot of so-called dichotomies, the single versus multi-species question is not an either or question. We need both approaches, but we need to be thinking of these differently, not as competing ideas, but as sequential or iterative adaptive steps in an overall process that aims to conserve both species and broad ecosystems. But there's an asymmetry that's important to understand as well, because species have different degrees of specialized needs and urgency of their population declines. If we manage only for the larger habitats or suites of species without taking those specialized needs into account in a very specific and targeted way, we could lose those species on the brink entirely. On the other hand, if we're focusing on the needs of the most urgent species, we're going to likely meet the needs of the broader species suites and will conserve habitats in the right places and right configurations to meet broader conservation goals, even though even this is an assumption that still needs to be tested. So the key is finding that balance point, target the drivers of declines and support the ecosystem functions that these species on the brink represent. So quickly, just another overriding concept for all these species is the need to be thinking about conservation across the full annual cycle of migratory birds. And of course, this is not a new concept either. We have mechanisms for working beyond our state and regional borders. And one of these is Southern Wings, the program within AFWA that states can use to support projects for species on their non-breeding grounds in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're going to probably talk more about that today. Although Southern Wings has been steadily growing, it is a tremendously underutilized resource by the states. Even though we know in many cases our birds are spending a majority of their annual cycle south of the US. So the road to recovery for America's birds passes through all 50 states. And now we want to hear from you. What do you think is most important? How road to recovery can help states specifically as we sit at this crossroads between new science and new funding, hopefully with Rawa. So here's just a few ways that we think states can engage immediately in recovering bird populations. One is to engage and support these species working groups to help them function more as proactive recovery teams. Add full life cycle conservation concepts into the state wildlife action plans, participate in and grow the Southern Wings program, embrace these new concepts of social science and co-production to make conservation more sustainable. And as Sarah said, we know that a lot of you are already doing these things, but we want to open up the discussion now to really see how we can help states engage even more. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah and Edwin to give a few more thoughts from a state perspective and then lead the remainder of this engagement session. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. It's great that the states got to hear from you about it. I think it's really impactful, and I appreciate the synopsis of and the background of what we've been doing. Okay, so for the next 10 minutes, Edwin and I are just going to we're just going to go a little bit more in depth on our experiences as states on some of these suggestions that Ken has up here on the screen. We'll leave that up here while we go through these, and then we'll start our discussion session. So I know that Ken and I think I also mentioned co-production, and a lot of people may not be familiar with that term. By co-production, it's just pretty much a fancy word of bringing everybody, relevant parties together from the get-go as research projects and implementation of habitat management are being developed. Reach out to, whether you're academia or states or an NGO, we can all do better, I think, and try and reach outside our silos in this way. I know many of you do already. But really pulling in managers, researchers, states, consider the state objectives in addition to academia, social scientists, human elements. And yes, many of you already do this, but including myself, we can all do better with this. And if you haven't yet, one suggestion is just to reach out to your local partners and researchers and share ideas. Perhaps you already have, but use Rawa as that trigger. Is this coming down the line? And what are your research objectives? Do they pair up with our swaps? Potentially try and just find those new ways to partner. And again, I know many of you do that, but we will need these partnerships more than ever with Rawa dollars coming down the pike. States won't be able to spend all that money in-house on research projects. We don't have the capacity. Many states don't. And so we'll need to get those Rawa dollars out the door. So creating those partnerships and laying that groundwork now will really help to get that money down the line. So Edwin and I are going to walk through a few of these. I'm going to touch on the Rawa and species on the brink things, but again, we acknowledge that many states already do some of these. Edwin and I are providing just examples and connecting the dots between potential Rawa opportunities and bird declines and road to recovery objectives. So we feel that the road to recovery serves a key purpose by formalizing a framework to accelerate this work of targeted species recovery. And this is a need we've identified through R2R, of course, this framework to help decision makers and others to recover species. But in my mind, I also see it as not just species on the brink and targeted recovery, but also supporting and encouraging these other actions like folding full life cycle into your swaps, southern wings, co-production, and trying to advocate for this, these pieces of the puzzle. So again, these are just ideas, but we want to hear from you directly after. So I wanted to give a very brief, like 2-sentence update on Rawa. I reached out to my conservation department, friends and contacts who are in the Rawa planning world, and they spoke with those who know that there's currently, as we know, it was voted out of committee weeks ago. There are 35 Senate co-sponsors and 189 House co-sponsors. So this has major bipartisan support. The next steps are to get it to the floor in both houses, ideally by July 4th. And I was just updated yesterday that it's looking like it will get to the House floor potentially by next week. So that's very exciting. So it continues on down the line and we just have our fingers and toes crossed. I recognize, and I want to say out loud, that there are intricacies and challenges with these Rawa dollars. You know, if any of you are federal aid coordinators, swap coordinators, or biologists, you know that you won't be able to spend millions of dollars on your own coordinating brand new research projects. And so again, those partnerships will be key to try and get that money out the door through agreements or otherwise, or habitat management. And I know a lot of this is easier said than done, but just to acknowledge that. We had that issue too before I left the conservation department, thinking through what we can do and how to efficiently do it. So with species on the brink, I'll just start with that one. Support work that fills knowledge gaps. This is pretty basic again for species on the brink, and potentially think through, do species on the brink occur in your state? Are there overlapping ranges? Are there ways for me to tie in with other states in that species range and partner and work together? Are there ways to plug those knowledge gaps? For instance, I think there aren't a ton of species for Missouri anyway that are on the species on the brink list, but there are a handful and others that migrate through Missouri. And one of them is a cerulean warbler. So I became more active in the cerulean warbler technical group and tried to advocate for Rawa dollars with our agency going to cerulean warbler work with Rawa funds. Also implementation, we can't forget habitat implementation and contracting to get habitat work done. So I want to say that out loud as well. Now for the next few topics, I'm going to turn it over to Edwin Juarez. He's the Arizona Bird Conservation Initiative ABSI coordinator for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. He's a migratory bird biologist with 16 years of experience developing, implementing, coordinating, and supporting conservation strategies for Arizona's priority birds. He leads ABSI by engaging partners in voluntary and collaborative conservation actions. These often involve multiple partners across large geographies, statewide, Western US, or Northwest Mexico. So besides leading ABSI, he's also active in multiple projects in collaboration with the Sonoran Joint Venture, Partners in Flight, Southern Wings, and other regional and national initiatives. And Edwin is also currently the PIF, Partners in Flight Western Working Group Chair. So welcome, Edwin, and I turn it over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that introduction. Well, welcome everyone. And I just briefly wanted to expand a little bit on several of the points that Ken made at the end of his slide, where we make suggestions or where opportunities where states can plug in. And I give some specific examples. I know many of the states are already working on this, and we wanted just to present them as opportunities to start a conversation and to have that engagement with all the states present right now. But as we know, many states are already participating in species working groups. For example, I'm involved in the P&J working group, the Yellow-billed cuckoo working group. Many of you are engaged in other such working groups. States can join existing species working groups or form new ones or support the formation of new ones. Or consider providing funding for implementation or coordinator positions. Many of these groups, I know the ones that I participate in, they're ad hoc groups where it's really an add-on to our responsibilities. And so formalizing the participation and the framework of the species working groups would supercharge the way these species working groups are working. So these are just starting points for idea sharing and discussion. And there's an upcoming R2R engagement session that will focus on species working groups and include a discussion on potential challenges working groups face when implementing R2R. and some of those challenges or some of those lessons learned came from previous R2R workshops. Also, states can consider including full life cycle conservation languages into the swaps. As we all know that we go through a cycle where we update our swaps, and so that presents an opportunity to include full life cycle conservation language into those swaps. That sets it up for state leadership to invest Rawa funds into these efforts. There's resources that exist for states to use this model language. Southern Wings has a template language that's been drafted based on some work that Missouri did in their swap. There's also parent supply conservation strategies that provide a lot of those languages and those linkages between the wintering and breeding grounds of many of our SGCN species. There's also the species-specific conservation plans, and also, of course, the plans from the bird initiatives, such as Partner Supply, Saving Our Shared Birds, that was published a few years ago. Of course, as Ken and Sarah has alluded to, there's Southern Wings, which is a ready-to-use mechanism to deliver this full life cycle conservation. Many states have already participated or are participating since 2009 when the program was established. We've had over about 32 states engage in Southern Wings projects. Currently, we have about 15 projects that in the portfolio of projects, and these are projects that have objectives that directly tie to they're of biological relevance to the states, and so there are multiple ways to participate in Southern Wings. And so those Southern Wings projects are ready to go. States can participate directly with an on-the-ground in-country partner. States can also participate to the flyway or through the regional associations or directly to a U.S. NGO based partner. And so there's many available options in terms of engaging and supporting Southern Wings. Also, those 15 projects, or basically the portfolio, but states can engage and develop their own projects. Southern Wings can help states link or identify partners in the countries where their birds are wintering, and so that we can facilitate that kind of collaboration. And one of the key things of Southern Wings is that it really benefits for having advocates within the state agencies, so that Southern Wings becomes a routine implementation tool for conserving many of the species on the brink. Also, the Southern Wings projects have available match identified, and so that would assist with the Rawa match requirements. And also really have strong reporting requirements that are part of the program. I'm involved in a lot of that reporting requirements, and other partners also generate those reports on an annual basis and develop this portfolio of projects. So that's kind of briefly those three things that we wanted remind folks as opportunities to participate in covering of the species. And really the key thing is we want to open up the discussion and hear from y'all and have that kind of dialogue. And I'll turn it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Edwin. I am shocked. We are 2 minutes early, people. 2 minutes early. That's 2 minutes extra of discussion. So yeah, this is great. So now we're going to move into our discussion engagement session, why we're all here today. So please don't be shy. I'm an extrovert, so I can't handle the awkward silence for minutes and minutes on end. I'm just kidding. If you can put your questions in the chat too, and we'll be monitoring that as well. And Tom will monitor that. And thank you, Tom, for doing that. And verbalize your questions as we move along. But please unmute yourself and raise your hand first. I forgot to say that. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, please remain muted until you have a comment. Use the raise hand function. Unmute when you're called upon. And again, Tom will monitor the chat, but we do prefer that you raise hands and unmute so we can hear your lovely voice. So don't be shy. So I know I had a few discussion prompts in our agenda, but just to really say those out loud. Do you all have other ideas? We want your input. Do you have other ideas for Rawa funding or plugging in with these R2R efforts? What are your barriers to plugging into these bird species declines or what we've presented? Is it support from your leadership? We can help with that. Is it other issues or just capacity issues? Or is there anything that we can help support you or overcome some of these barriers? So let's just start with that. You're welcome to share other things as well. But yes, Andrea, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I've been trying, I work for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department as the non-game bird biologist. I have been trying for years to engage my administrators into participating in Southern Wings, and I have hit roadblocks every single time. Do you have any suggestions on how to elevate that so that those with the decision makers and those with the purse strings see the value versus, just coming from me like, oh yeah, birds are great. So any help to, to change those minds would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a tough road to hoe sometimes, Andrea. I totally hear you. When I was still at MDC, I was constantly bringing that up and having those discussions and talking about the relevance and the importance of caring for birds and the threats they face when they're beyond our borders. So I hear you. There are a lot of Southern Wings resources that we can provide you, like PDFs, or Deb Hahn is the leader through AFWA, as you probably know, and I think she would be more than happy to meet with your leadership to talk to them about the advantages. I'm happy to do that. Edwin is happy to do that. We're on the Southern Wings Technical Committee, which is a group of really active states with Southern Wings, and we're there for you to help. We are also hosting a Southern Wings 101 webinar that will just be an hour, very brief. It will be, I believe, correct me, Edwin, myself, Edwin, Craig Thompson with Wisconsin, which I think Craig is on here today, and Deb Hahn. So we're going to present on exactly what you're talking about. What's the value? Why should we do it? Especially with Rawa coming. So we've thought of that, and I will get you the date. I have to look it up maybe when we have another question. But we will provide that also in a follow-up email to you with that information. So we see that need, and we're trying to reach out to leadership, not just the biologists, because a lot of the biologists know the merits of that. So we will be in touch. We're also going to record like a 20-minute one of the Southern Wings 101 to have on the Southern Wings website so that biologists can share that with their leadership, because it really does take an advocate. Edwin, do you have more to add to that?
I just want to add briefly, I think sometimes one of the barriers is the level of comfort with sending funds abroad. And I think one of the key cool things about Southern Wings is that there's multiple ways to provide that funding. So, a state may feel more comfortable providing that funding through the flyway, something, that they may do on a routine basis for other projects, or partnering directly with a US-based NGO that they're familiar with or they know. And so I think that sometimes that may be a potential barrier, but I think there's multiple avenues for setting up funding those projects from a state.
Thanks, Edwin. I also want to call out what Edwin said in the chat. Always link it back to waterfowl. Same concept as waterfowl, right? Why are we supporting and conserving wetlands up north? They're not in our states. Some of our states they are, I know. But in Missouri, we give a lot of money to DU and support wetland conservation, which is awesome. And so I would always bring it back to that same concept, and it benefits a lot of species. So great question. Others, what else you got? Barriers. What do you think about all this? Oh, it's Andrew Cox, one of my very best friends. Go, Andrew.
Hi, Sarah. It's good to see you. I do have one question, which is, have you guys thought about how to help sort of develop state-specific priorities in a way that they fit into this broad national or international framework, but they help states understand how to focus on particular aspects of the effort? Yeah, that's the question.
Go ahead. Do others have thoughts? I don't want to just jump in here. I don't think that we've focused on state scale yet, but that's really good feedback. Are you saying that you think it'd be easier if states had that that list of activities to do, kind of like what we've talked about today, but that's more state specific that you could share with your leadership to get that support? Is that what you mean? Or
Yeah, I think I was just thinking, I mean, you know, if I look at the list of, there's a lot of species, there's a lot to do. And if I look at the list, I'm like, okay, well, these species make sense for us. And so in that respect, it's a pretty straightforward thing. But I was just wondering, well, if each state is just focusing on, you know, the portion of the overall effort they can do, will it sort of organically fill out the overall need? Or does it make sense to think about where states best fit into the overall effort in a more coordinated manner? Did I just repeat myself and add no information, or did that make sense?
yeah, but I'll pretend like you didn't. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. No, I hear what you're saying completely. And I think there is a piece just when I hear that question that I don't want to be R2R and tell states what to do. There's a level of that as well, but we do want to provide guidance and support for sharing things with your leadership. And in my mind, rather than just being state specific, of course, in a perfect world, we would work across these species ranges with other states that are neighboring, whether that's through competitive state wildlife grants or other efforts like that. But with Rawa, that may be less of a need to go through. I mean, it's still going to be a funding rigmarole to get Rawa funding federally, but rather than only a CSWIG being these multi-state efforts. Ken, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, if I'm interpreting your question right, Andrew, it's interesting that, you know, when Partners in Flight formed in the 1990s, all the states that's what made up all the working groups were the state non-game. And those were new positions in a lot of cases. So I think that what's can happen right now, there's an Eastern and Western working group of Partners in Flight. There are these species working groups that we've been talking about. So I think to fit in and to magnify up to that larger scale, the more states can participate in those regional and range-wide initiatives, that's the way to do it. And very early on, I remember being a project that was trying to get the states to focus outside of their borders and more at the regional level. And it seems like, a lot of these barriers and issues sort of come back around over and over again. But I think that's where we are right now. So the more you can get involved in these larger initiatives and represent the state, the better.
I also know you have no lack of things to do with all the endangered species in Florida, Andrew, and that's legit for sure. Paul.
I would just also add, I mean, and emphasize that species working group level, I think is important. But I think states are in a really good position to help when it comes time to kind of combine them in the conservation and package 3 or 4 species that, are needing some conservation action, that there are some similarities. I think they're going to be able to have that perspective, particularly for their state species that are on some sort of decline or needing recovery.
What else you got? We have a question in the chat from Katie. Thank you, Katie. Do you have plans to engage with the regional initiatives such as CICUS and MLI, et cetera? This is part of what Paul mentioned early on, is how do we all fit together, right? How does PIF and NABC and road recovery and all of these other initiatives fit together? And honestly, we don't have the answer for that of exactly where road recovery is, but I think that in my mind, and this is just my perspective, this is not speaking on behalf of road to recovery, but I feel like when I was at a state level and now I'm at this Midwest level, it's like, what can we do now? Where can we plug in now and get moving? And we're not saying road recovery is the only way. If it makes sense for you to engage with MLI or CICUS, we're just asking that we plug in some way for these targeted response for potentially these species on the brink, or these just rapidly declining species that occur where you are. Do others have thoughts on that? Paul?
Yeah, I would just add that I think all of those regional, joint ventures kinds of structures are really important ultimately to connect this species working group, species work to. I mean, because ultimately there's a habitat component to most of these efforts in some way, shape, or form. We just have to understand what that habitat is. So if we have no connection to these regional initiatives or regional landscape things, I think we're missing a huge opportunity and a waste of effort if we don't have direct connection to them. Almost like a sound corny, but almost like a nesting, if you will. I mean, I think it's really important.
Agree. Kristen, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you. I have to first start out with a huge thanks in giving me hope. I recently had a conversation with someone who asked, why? Why do you do that? Why is it important? And I was like, I felt like I was hit in the gut. I was like, what? Why not? It's at the foundation of everything we do. So thanks for bringing me back to the why, because it really is great. And this group is doing a lot of great work. I'm going to jump back to the barriers piece on a broader level. I work with grassland birds, specifically kestrels is one of my research topics of interest, and aerial insectivores. Those declines are directly related to pesticide use and clean farming and agricultural inputs. And it is very difficult. That is a barrier I don't know how to move, how to approach, how to be diplomatic about. And I'm wondering, like, this gets more onto the not bird specific actions, but policy and advocacy and the kind of the social science side of things. How do we start to move that needle? Because I do think that is at the crux of where it's the insect decline is leading to the bird decline, leading to the, all those pieces add up. And should I have been an entomologist instead of an ornithologist is my main question. But no, what I'm really asking is, how do we as states start to affect change in working better with our Department of Ag and better with industry to figure out how we don't just put chemicals on the landscape as a preventative measure and kind of get that pendulum swung back?
Great question.
So, I mean, I'll kick in, but I'm going to give it to Ken because I think he could add a perspective here. But I if you mentioned pesticides, I think we all would agree that there are significant problems, and that requires almost a ground level swell of change that might be necessary for ultimately to make a difference. And efforts like the Grassland Summit is one of those, to me, is beginning to gel into such an effort that may indeed lead to change. And I'm sure they have it on their radar screen in terms of actions. But you've hit a big one. I mean, but we've proven we can do that. I mean, in the past, when there has been a clarion call to action in terms of some of the most deadly ones that we identified, we were able to do it. So, I mean, I come back to still being optimistic, Kristen, that we can do it now. Specific steps. Ken, he's the smart guy. Oh, pointing. Wow, where are you pointing?
Pete. Go, Pete.
Pete.
So, Kristen, I think your question is really a fantastic one, and it's the challenge here is it's going to be different for each of these species and each of these landscapes and each of these contexts. And so, and that's exactly why we've created the Road to Recovery. Is so we are providing a resource to states, to individuals like you, whether it's the biology or it's the social science aspect that's needed to understand in each of these species or each of these cases for how to move the species up that road to recovery. And so I just want to make sure, and this was said earlier, but I want to make sure it's clear, we are building the resources so you could contact Road to Recovery and say, I need some help from a social scientist for this species. It looks like it's being challenged here. And then we can sort of have consult with our social scientists or with the biologists for how to actually move that strategy forward, whether it's on the natural science side or the social science side, which might be a policy related problem for at the state level or multi-state level or international level. Because when you start to dig into it, the truth of the matter is we probably shouldn't be entomologists. We probably shouldn't be ornithologists. We probably should be social scientists. And that's a realization that I came to too late in life, unfortunately, because that's my love is birds, like so many people here, but to save them really requires dealing with humans. And that's where it gets really challenging. And it really, so we are hiring these social scientists to aid you all in taking on these challenges. What are the best approaches for implementation? What are the non-confrontational approaches to get us further up that road to recovery? So while I don't have a specific answer in your case, we totally realize that this is the gap. This is the hole, and this is where we need to sort of start filling in. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, it's hard for a lot of us with policy, right? Being state and federal to really get in there in the ring and advocate for things. Eileen, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thanks for this webinar. I'm looking forward to getting help with this issue. I wanted to just share a little bit of a reality check. Not all of us even have a biologist that's dedicated to non-game birds. We do our best, but I share that because there's been reference to these species-specific groups or these other groups. We're not engaged very much in those. We are in the flyway and in some of the JVs, but I guess I would ask that you not assume that we have an established framework. As I said, we do our best. So with our wildlife action planning, not only are we hearing from the bird side, we're hearing from lots of invert stuff, lots of pollinator stuff. Herps are in trouble. And so a barrier, I don't think we have an internal barrier as far as support, but if we can get aid in bringing this to a habitat level, that's going to help us in our wildlife action plan revisions and in our spending of recovering dollars. So I just don't think we're going to have a lot of time to dedicate specifically to birds, but we will focus on habitats. So if there are tools that we can identify, and this is a big ask, but not just for birds, but for these other species, if there is somebody who can figure out how to prioritize habitats for multiple uses, that would be a big help for us.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's good feedback. And yeah, that is an assumption that there are biologists to take this on and to get more active and things like that. I have a question is, do you know if enough Rawa funds will come to your state to hire positions like that or to advocate for the hiring of positions like that or not? It's just an idea. I know that the Conservation Department in Missouri is looking to hire like 30 new staff to help with capacity for federal aid and all this stuff that's just going to be flooded in the agency. And I know that those are challenges for sure. I would, and other people please chime in too. So I'm not the only one just blabbering on, but I do think that from these species working groups, there's implementation recommendations and habitat implementation that come out of those working groups, and we can do a better job in future as those become potentially more active or do a better job of sharing those with states. And those are generally habitat-based implementation and habitat management. So we can certainly, I will take note of that, and we will definitely communicate that to states better. I think we can be a facilitator for that.
And just a real quick response, Sarah, that is a good point, but kind of we've been cautioned a little bit not to package recovering as just a vehicle to get a whole bunch more state employees. But the cooperative nature of it, really the resource value of it, as opposed to yeah, we've got a list of 50 new
Right.
positions. I mean, we have to have that happen,
Right.
but we're not, I'll just speak for South Dakota. That's really not our main message.
Right. Oh, agree. I mean, the conservation department, we didn't come up with the full-time positions first off, you know, and all of that is still in draft and everything, but there are a lot of projects suggested before that. But Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that for your position specifically, Eileen, you know, Partners in Flight from the beginning has really focused on providing those resources. And the plans themselves have a lot of that information tying the focal species to the habitats. There's lots of different habitat guidelines that have been produced. I think hopefully all of this should be available, you know, to start at least on the Partners in Flight, PIF.org website, partnersinflight.org website. And then a lot of that has grown through the various joint ventures and some of the NGOs like Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in your region that have produced a lot of those habitat guidelines that are focused on the priority species often that we're still talking about here in terms of urgency. So there are, and Partners in Flight is talking now even about trying to hire a series of conservation delivery specialists. So, you know, at different levels, we've always tried to provide that resource support depending on the level where each state and and entity is. So definitely reach out to some of the other neighboring states that are more involved in some of that stuff as well. And then hopefully Rawa will be able to help you grow your program as well.
I can also make a point that when we send our follow-up email, Eileen, to share some of those species plans that may be helpful for species that where they've already been developed. But as those come out and are developed more, you know, get hopefully an infusion of activity, I will share those as well with states.
And I guess, and I don't want to dominate the conversation, but the point I'm making is, yes, there are a lot of resources, but there are also a lot of resources for inverts, for herps, for
Sure.
aquatic. You know, that's my point is,
yeah,
a lot of us have a lot on our plate, and yes, hopefully Rawa will help alleviate that. But again, just don't make the assumption that we all have the staff to dedicate to diving into this the way we might like to.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, noted. That's a great point. I want to verbalize Travis Boom's comment in the chat. He says a really valuable thing that could be done that I haven't heard yet is getting non-consumptive users engaged with state leadership and convince them this work is valuable and needed. That's a huge reason why waterfowl numbers have increased while non-game have declined. DU talks to state directors all the time. State work and priorities are set largely by political appointees that are swayed by direct constituent engagement. The real challenge that I see is getting state directors on board, not us biologists. I see this as a values issue more than a science issue. So I agree with that. And this Southern Wings meeting that we're actually having, I forgot to mention, is we're trying to target leadership. We're going to have a webinar, then we're going to have this recorded Southern Wings thing. And I know that this is not just Southern Wings, what you're talking about. And I fully agree with that. And I agree with everything you said. But especially for Southern Wings, we're targeting directors and the heads of wildlife, you know, wildlife chiefs and people who make budget decisions and can really inform that stuff. And so we're having Sarah Parker-Pauley, the director of Missouri Department of Conservation, introduce the session and talk about why, you know, MDC sees the value in investments like that. But I completely agree. And engagement at those upper levels is really important. I know that Deb Hahn, again with Southern Wings, tries to get in on the director meetings at the AFWA meetings and things like that often, because we know that that's a whole second level of this, is that we don't have to convince you all on the ground. We have to convince the people who will support your budget items and know all the background to support that when they see it in the budget, things like that. I completely agree. I think about those things all the time. How do we harness those people and their money to help support conservation? It's a toughie. But anybody else have comments on that one? We have about 6 minutes left.
Well, I might just say that's a great takeaway for R2R to think about how we can, in some of the next steps, do what like you have said, Travis, that DU has been so effective at, and that is getting the attention of leadership, particularly in states I mean, I was with Ducks Unlimited, and we use that as a very effective tool to continue to remind them of their responsibilities in waterfowl. R2R can try to do that, and with others to focus.
Agree. I think about that a lot. It's like there has to be a way we can take that template and use it for non-game species and for non-waterfowl groups. But thank you. We'll
Sarah.
definitely, yes.
I'd like to add a little comment
Please.
following up on Eileen. I mean, in Arizona, personally, I feel I'm overextended in species working groups. You know, we participate in at least 5 of them, and some get more attention from me than others, just because we cannot be involved in every meeting, in every species working group meeting. And so it's definitely something that we're definitely aware that we're already limited in time and capacity. And for me, what I see the R2R framework as a way, it's also in my mind, a messaging that can reach leadership in different states through this associations or through flyways, that this process is designed to really formalize the work of the species working groups, and that hopefully that will open up more opportunities where a state leadership would be open to, you know, funding additional positions or providing more formal dedication to these species working groups and less of an ad hoc approach, because that's how I feel sometimes, where I'm really triaging my participation in some of these working groups.
Yep. Thank you, Edwin. I feel that. Yes. Okay. Lisa makes another comment in the chat about, yes, non-game wildlife diversity staff being pulled in many directions. I totally hear that. It's hard to become more involved in a lot of these initiatives. And in a related note, it'd be helpful to examine suites or guilds that include birds and other taxa that share some similar habitat requirements. So not generic, but specific habitat conditions and features. And I completely agree. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, Kristen, for your comment too about supporting wetlands and waterfowl focus as an example to point to. But with terrestrial landscapes, the economic value of those lands are a huge barrier. I totally get it. I mean, this is why I think we haven't replicated the model, right? Because it's so hard, especially with grassland birds in the east. It's very difficult, but yeah, I support it too. It's trying to figure out, yeah, how to overcome a lot of those barriers competing with human food, at least in the east, yeah. Okay. Yes, please. We probably have time for like one last question, or provide your questions or comments in the chat, or if anybody has any other comments or wrap up, we have a few minutes for that. And then I will kind of bring us home here. Okay. Ken?
Oh, did I do something? So
You just unmuted.
I'm just wondering if, if we are providing some kind of forum to continue this conversation. If you have a Google Doc or something, you know, just I suspect that there's a lot more comments we haven't heard, and
Yeah.
And the chat's going to go away. So yeah, just a reminder to us to try to provide that forum.
Yes, and I plan to follow up with all the participants. I'm going to provide you the recording link, and I've also been taking notes along the way to provide links to the Road to Recovery website, the ACAD, the Avian Conservation Assessment Database, Southern Wings, providing swap verbiage, education documents to grow support. I'll also send you the dates of that Southern Wings 101 webinar we plan to hold. I'll provide a little more details on this next Road to Recovery engagement session, which is focusing on species working groups. So if you're even interested in that, you can't just dive in, but if you just want to learn more about it, please attend. I'm also going to send out information about our next Partners in Flight Science Committee meeting. I'm going to send that pretty much to most of the people on this list, or at least to states. That's July 12th through 14th. It's virtual, and we'll be talking about diving into some of these other science needs, and including a discussion on road to recovery and things like that. So y'all are welcome to attend those. I think I will wrap up because we just have a minute left. I just wanted to, again, thank everybody for taking the time to do this. I know it's a Friday, but I was just so blown away that we had so many participants. So thank you for your time. We need you all so badly in this effort. I know this is a busy time of year with field seasons and everything else. So again, thanks. We hope that we've provided some food for thought for you. And thank you for your ideas that you've provided to us. No doubt there are many, many barriers that we all face, and all of us being overextended for sure. So I definitely hear that in both roles that I've played so far in bird conservation. So everyone have a great weekend. We'll be reaching back out to you to continue the conversation. Please don't hesitate to email me if you have questions. I will put my email in the chat, but you'll hear from me anyway via email. So please follow up with questions and continue to be engaged, and we'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great weekend.
You're muted, Sarah. Are you talking to us?
Yeah, I'm mostly talking to myself. I'm trying to capture some of the comments in the chat for things to include, which we'll see again, but just for things to share with people. Okay.
Sarah, did you put, I'm looking for your email in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Here you go.
And you're going to send it out. You'll obviously send it out to all the participants anyway. And that actually the people who have registered and didn't participate will still get it as well.
Yeah, mid-week next week is probably going to be in the field Monday and Tuesday, but I will send that to everybody.
That would be great, Sarah. And I like this idea of trying to figure out how to continue the engagement, particularly at state director levels. We've got to crack that one a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, do we want to stay on here for a few minutes?
Yeah, I suspect that the rectangles that are still there are people who are not at their computers, but
Well, we're down to 10 participants, so.
They're asleep, maybe. Just kidding.
Oh my gosh. Please, Sarah.
Okay, wake up. Just kidding. Okay.
You might stop the recording if you haven't already.
Oh, yeah.